Hello everybody, welcome to this webinar, Risk and the Board, Communicating Cyber Risk in Critical Business Terms. I'm your host, Simon Marvel, founder and CEO of Acuity Risk Management. I'm delighted to be joined today by Jason Creasy, founder of Gericano and former head of research at the Information Security Forum. I'll ask Jason to introduce himself a little bit later. We'd like to make this session interactive, so please add questions in the chat box as we go along, and we'll leave time at the end to answer those. If you'd like to contact us directly, our email and LinkedIn address is on the screen. We'd love to engage with you afterwards, so please feel free to do so. We'll share the slides and the recording as well, so you'll have our details if you want to reach out at a later date. This event is the third in what was originally a series of 3. We ran a webinar, Cyber Ready, 7 Steps to Building a Risk-Based Approach to Cybersecurity, and then quantifying your cyber risk, measuring what matters. Both of these are available to watch on demand via our website. Today we're talking about risk and the board. We had some feedback from the previous 2 sessions where some people were asking to see demonstrations of how our Stream Integrated Risk Manager platform can support the issues that we've been discussing in this series. So we've scheduled a 4th webinar, Cyber Ready, Stream in Action. That's be an hour-long session, and we'll do a bit of a deep dive into Stream. My agenda for today, just start with a little bit of background, then talk about the state of cyber risk reporting as we see it at the moment. Jason will then come in and talk about his experiences with executive reporting on cyber risk and where he sees it going in the future. And then we'll bring things to a close by talking about what we see as the way forward for reporting. In the previous webinars, I've put up this slide outlining what we see as good security outcomes. And from a board perspective, I think this is very relevant to today's session. So in my opinion, this is what boards of directors are looking for in terms of good outcomes for security. They're looking for resilience to loss events. We all know that we can't avoid loss events and breaches altogether, but we do want those to be, if they occur, tolerable. And we certainly want to avoid cyber catastrophe. We want to make sure that our resources are used effectively and efficiently, focused on the risks that could cause us the greatest harm. We want our spending to be optimized, so have confidence that we're getting value for money for our expenditure on cybersecurity. We want to be able to understand the need for investment where we identify it and to justify the ROI for new cybersecurity products and services. And as we rapidly sort of move towards digitalizing our businesses, then it's important that strategic decisions that we make around those initiatives are risk informed as well from a cyber risk perspective. And then I think overall, the board is seeking confidence that cyber risk is under control. Now, there were just 3 points that from the previous webinars that I just wanted to quickly summarize because they're pertinent to today's webinar. And the first one is drawing upon a report by the global strategic management consultancy, McKinsey, who released a report in late 2019 called the RiskBased Approach to Cybersecurity. McKinsey identified that the majority of organizations these days take a maturity-based approach to cybersecurity, and that's really based around building security capabilities or addressing gaps or weaknesses in security. And they identify a number of problems with that. Firstly, that it can result in unmanageable growth of control and spending escalating as we try to protect everything. That in turn results in implementation gridlock as the scarce resources that we have with the appropriate skills to implement cybersecurity get overstretched. So McKinsey identified the next stage on the journey being moved towards a risk-based approach, where the focus is on reducing enterprise risk and in particular focusing on risk reduction. This allows us then to align the board's targets for risk reduction with the security improvement programs and actions that we're taking. It allows us to optimize defenses based around risk reduction, resilience and cost. And also McKinsey showed that it allows us to reduce costs overall as well by focusing our effort and our costs by targeting areas of greatest risk and the assets that we're most concerned about protecting. Second point was that cyber risk is continuous and it changes all the time. So it's not something that can be assessed once annually or even every 6 months or every 3 months, because it changes all the time. Now, we achieve our business outcomes through critical business processes, which in turn depend upon critical and sensitive information assets and other supporting assets. Things happen which can increase our risk. We can be subject to new threats, new critical vulnerabilities might emerge. Audit reports, penetration tests, for example, might identify weaknesses in control. We might suffer incidents, which again is indicating some root cause issues relating to risk. So all of these events have the effect of increasing our risk profile over time. Of course, we can take action to address these. We can patch critical vulnerabilities. We can implement audit points. We can implement new cybersecurity products and services, and these have the effect of reducing risk. So over time, our risk profile changes. And if we can understand our tolerance for risk, then at some points we'll be below our tolerance for risk, but at other points we might be above tolerance. And we talked in previous webinars about operating above risk tolerance being a leading indicator for future problems further down the line. So expenditure going above budget, for example, further down the line, and also ultimately business outcomes deteriorating if we're suffering incidents and serious impacts and costs and reputational damage and so on from incidents that are not tolerable, then we're going to see a deteriorating business performance further down the line. And the third point really was that to make risk-based decisions, we need to use a language that everybody, in particular the board, understands. And there are some attributes of financial measurement of cyber risk which make it particularly suitable. First of all, the dollar or the euro, the pound, the yen, whatever, is the universal language of business. It's understood by everybody and translatable. It's a hard measure of success or failure in both the private sector and the public sector. World Health Organization potentially has lost $400 million worth of funding just at the weekend. Reputational and other impacts manifest themselves ultimately as financial impacts. Wells Fargo in 2014 had a mis-selling scandal which caused very serious reputational impact, and over the following years their loan book slumped. There was a decline in deposits, revenue, profits, and so on. Quite often we see that reputational impact causes customer churn, which means that we lose the lifetime value of customers that we've invested in creating over the years, and we also have to invest more to acquire new customers, so there's a financial impact there as well. Risk, of course, is all about uncertainty, and we know how to model uncertainty in financial analysis using statistical techniques, and this then allows us to aggregate financial impact across lines of business, business units, countries, and so on, and to prioritize areas of greatest risk. And it also allows us to set tolerances in financial terms and compare those against our financial loss profile, again, the leading indicator of potential problems in the future. And then, of course, our cybersecurity budgets are all set in financial terms. If we want to understand value for money and ROI, we need to compare the costs of our security products and services against risk, also in financial terms where we can, to make these comparisons understandable. So overall, financial measurement is a good basis for planning, forecasting, and investment across the business, and applies equally well to cyber risk as it does to other enterprise risks. So if we now just go on to have a look at the current state of reporting, and I'm going to refer here to another report from McKinsey, which was published in January of 2020, specifically focused on cyber risk reporting. It was called Enhanced Cyber Risk Reporting, Opening Doors to Risk-Based Cybersecurity. McKinsey asked executives at financial institutions in Europe and North America about their actual experiences with cyber risk management and reporting. And they said that cyber risk management can only be effective when the information it's based on is accurate. Yet at many companies, it was considered to be inadequate and failing to provide executives with the facts that they needed to make informed decisions about countermeasures. And because of the information gaps, managers often applied a standard set of controls to all company assets. And as a result, low priority assets were overprotected whilst critical assets could remain dangerously exposed. And this, of course, is the definition of a maturity-based approach to cybersecurity. So what McKinsey found was that current reporting in many organizations is actually perpetuating a maturity-based approach to cybersecurity. And just looking a little more specifically at some problems with reporting to the board, both Bay Dynamics in 2016 and McKinsey this year found that reporting was too technical. Reports were compiled by IT specialists for other IT specialists. They were very technical with little guidance to decision makers on how cyber risk relates to other risks, such as financial and legal risks. There were many gaps in information. For example, there was little information on top risks, key assets, recent incidents, key controls, accountability for implementation, resilience to cyber threats, and the ROI for investments in security. Reports were structured by systems, servers, and applications rather than business units, processes, and functions, countries, or legal entities. And often the reports were standalone with no integrated view on cyber risk across the organization. McKinsey concluded that currently risk managers are flying blind. Many companies rely on a patchwork of reports from different sources to manage cyber risk. And as a result, executives at these companies are unable to assess return from their cybersecurity investments, and they lack needed information about cyber risk levels, the effectiveness of controls, and the status of protection for key assets. Available data was incomplete, inconsistent, and not reliable as a basis for decision making. And that, of course, is fairly damning and has some quite serious consequences for organizations. So executives really have no clear sense of the overall magnitude of risk from cyber attacks, human errors, system glitches, and other events. They don't know what to prioritize to improve protection of their key assets against the biggest threats. They have limited understanding of the contributions that their security programs are making to actually reducing risk. And cyber risk managers found it difficult to decide on the areas of focus for cybersecurity investments or to justify their ultimate decisions to the board. And there was no clear correlation between escalating costs and reduction in enterprise security. And I think this goes some way to explaining why, after all this time and all of the investment in cybersecurity products and services that we've seen over recent years, forecast to escalate to $170 billion in 2020, that we aren't really seeing the good security outcomes that we were talking about at the beginning of this webinar. So that's just some introduction and setting the scene in terms of what we see as the current state of cyber risk reporting to the board. What I'd like to do now is to bring Jason in to talk about his experiences with cyber risk reporting and how he sees things. So Jason, I wonder if perhaps you could start by telling everyone a bit about yourself and your experience with cyber risk reporting to the exec.
Thanks very much, Simon. In my experience, I've come at it from two different perspectives. I've spent much of my time running cybersecurity research projects, and we've looked at how all aspects of cyber risk are carried out and how they can be improved, and also in particular about how we can improve the effectiveness and indeed impact of cyber risk reporting to the executive board. I've also looked at it through my own company, Gericano, in a number of different ways, particularly when we've been running management projects for organizations who want to know about what they need to report and why. And also when we've looked at strategy, because people saying, okay, as part of strategy, it tends to be all about where are we now and where is it we want to get to. And that includes the reporting element of things. So hopefully I'll be able to bring a slightly different perspective.
Great, thanks very much, Jason. First question then is perhaps you could tell us about, in your experience, how you see cyber risk typically reported to executives.
Okay, well, in many cases, the short answer is that it often isn't. It isn't really reported at all or effectively. And to qualify that a little bit more, often elements of cyber risk are reported, but not in the sort of depth or in the sort of way that executives would like to hear about them. They tend to come in three main formats as far as I've seen. First of all, a list of things that the security department or related part of the organisation has actually done. So we could be doing things like, well, okay, we've written 3 new standards and we've run 15 risk assessments and we've had 63 people attend a security awareness scheme, which is good information and useful to feed back to management, but doesn't really actually give them much of a handle on information risk or in terms of what's the context of that in the organisation. I think the second thing is that people often want to report numbers. We all like to see numbers and they can be very effective, but they tend to look at numbers in terms of, for example, number of incidents experienced. So in particular, they look at the sorts of incidents that are easier for them to count, because we all tend to do that, such as the malware or phishing attacks or things of that nature, and they may not go down into some of the other types of incident that cause damage. Organisations are much more now moving towards, when they're looking at incident reporting, looking at, well, was it a severity 1 or a severity 2 or severity 3? So they're linking it to how much damage it's doing, which is much more of a risk related perspective. And of course, the third one is people look at the extent of compliance with various standards. So they could be their own internal standards, or they could be popular external standards, such as ISO 27001 or 27002, and the NIST cybersecurity framework. There's a lot of value in reporting against compliance. It's an important part of many organisations, and I don't think it's going to be going away anytime soon. So what are the sort of problems with that kind of reporting? And I think, again, there's a threefold, is that these controls are, in many cases, more like baseline controls that need to be tailored to particular situations and supplemented with additional controls that look at more technical or specialist areas, particularly when you're running, for example, customer-facing web applications with big business dependencies related to them. The second thing is that they don't really have a great deal of risk elements. Some people have mapped risks or threats to their controls and to their standards. With some sort of decent risk management system, you can start getting a lot more value out of that. And the third thing is these controls are not often based on effectiveness. And if I can add a little bit to that, in my experience in days gone by, and even now as a qualified auditor, or rather, shall I say, a reformed auditor, often people just look at, well, are the controls in place? So we're doing that control, tick in the box, great. If you go a little bit further, you can see, well, is that control working as intended? And the third way, if you're really looking at effectiveness, you need to look at, does it actually reduce risk? So is it effective in what it does? So those are the kinds of things that is typically reported to the exec.
Thanks, Jason. It sounds to me not as though it's a maturity-based approach to cybersecurity that you're primarily seeing at the moment. Is that fair?
I think that's right. There is some movement away from that, but the maturity, and it tends to be maturity of how well people are doing against standards rather than maturity of how well are they doing against a more integrated quantitative risk framework.
Yeah. Thank you for that. The next question sort of follows on quite nicely. Which reporting formats do you see typically being used?
I think the short answer is PowerPoint, and we get death by PowerPoint. Although when they're reporting to the exec, you can only allow to have limited amount of time. You've only got a few slides, but on those slides reported in a number of different ways. And as I said, some of the information about what is reported comes out, but people use radars, which can be effective, and they use dashboards, security cockpits, and they may use traffic lights and things like balanced scorecards, all of which can be very effective and useful. And it's worth looking at a variety of those. You tend to find things like radars and traffic lights are some of the most ones. And I think on the previous slide, we looked at the NIST cybersecurity framework, the 5 elements of this framework. And you can see here we've got different levels, so they're green, amber, they're red. So the people who are more advanced have got this as part of an integrated dashboard, and if executives are interested in a particular topic, say access control, which is red in this example, they can click on it and go to the more detailed analysis behind it. So that tends to be how they're looking at things, and traffic lights as well. So you've got a combination here of, are we covering the waterfront in terms of the higher level elements behind the 5 phases of the NIST cybersecurity framework, and also the traffic light approach, which often does help because organizations, particularly execs, want to know what are the big deal ticket items. The next slide shows us a radar, and a radar here, again, it can be very effective, but it's still another way. It tends to be of a maturity-based approach, reporting how well we're doing against our current posture. So some people would just have, for example, the blue bar, which is the current posture. If you're going up a step, then you've got like a target posture of where we'd like to be. So you can need to go towards that as well. And you might also have other colors like red for risks and green for controls that people do on different types of radars. So that's the sort of thing that people are currently reporting.
Lovely, thanks, Jason. So we've talked about the sort of reporting that execs are typically receiving and the formats and so on, but what do you think executives really want to know?
I think the first thing is ask them and ask other key stakeholders about what they want to know. And it tends to be they want to see things in a business-focused way. So whatever you're doing, what difference does it make? At a high level, that could be just a classic question of how secure are we? And we can have some metrics. The answer to that is nobody is ever really sure, but I wouldn't advise telling them that. But I want to know, are we secure? Are we compliant? But also particularly, are we within tolerance in terms of our cyber risk? So a good organization would set a risk appetite, they'd implement a set of controls, they'd look at risk management, and then they'd look at how well, what their tolerance is to those risks when risks come in or when incidents are experienced. They also need to know, or would like to know, what are the big deal tickets? So what is just the most important things that are happening to us? And also, how well are we protecting our critical assets, often referred to as the crown jewels? So what is it that's really important to us that's the core of our business? And in the modern world, it's particularly important to be protecting those. Other few things that they like to know about. One is our old friend Rosie. Things all rosy in the garden, but it actually stands for return on security investment. As the Americans would say, where are we spending our best bang per buck? But also looking at things like how well are we doing against targets? So things like measurement, not without going over the board and showing them a pile of statistics, which can be misleading at best and not effective at worst, as how well you're measuring these things. So I think it's that kind of a thing that people are looking for. One particular chief operating officer who once said to me, okay, well, this risk stuff, he said, is cyber risk is very easy. All I want to know is what can go wrong, how likely is it to go wrong, and so what if it does? So the what can go wrong could be, well, that's an incident or a risk. How likely it's to go wrong is likelihood or something along that lines. So what if it does is the impact on the organization. So those tend to be the sort of things that people want to. And here's the famous risk heat map. Many organizations use this sort of risk heat map, often in combination with the traffic light approach. So for example, the low risk on the left may be shown as green, the medium in the middle amber, and the high or very high risk shown as red. So this sort of thing, but it also demonstrates the 3 elements saying we've got an overall risk there, the little black buttons. Sometimes on the right hand side of this sort of matrix, those are the actual risks that people have written down. So data center not available, critical amounts of personal data exposed, information on important business applications has been tampered with. So for example, people have changed the prices of some of our products, or they've altered a foreign exchange rate so that everything has been gone awry. And some people will also put a little arrow next to each of the little circles to see where it's gone. The likelihood is how likely is it to go wrong, and the severity is the so what if it does. But I find it easier to remember things if you talk to them more in everyday language and in the sort of ways that can impact the business.
And you find this, Jason, quite a good visualization for execs to understand the higher risks.
I think it varies. I think many people, particularly when it comes to operational risk, are able to do this and link it back to those. There tends to be things like harm reference tables or impact reference table that support this. So, for example, if I've got a particular risk, the likelihood may be in terms of, well, it's very high likelihood or it's almost certain to happen, but the severity or impact could be in terms of a financial impact, an impact on reputation, operational compliance, on staff morale, or in many organisations where there's a safety element, it could result in either severe injury or in some cases death. So I think it is something that people do like. It's increasing in sophistication because at the moment here we've just got solid numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And as people are sort of slowly moving towards a more quantitative approach or a combination of qualitative and quantitative, you'll see things like ranges are used more rather than just numbers.
Sure. And sort of top 10 reporting, top 10 risks reporting, in my experience, is pretty popular as well.
Yes, I think this is variation on what are the big deal ticket items. The quantitative assessment here is like expected loss per year. Other people might know this as ALE, or annual loss expectancy. When you look at what's the value of particular assets, and you can say, well, if they were compromised in some way, then we would actually potentially lose this amount on an annual loss expectancy. So you need to have the likelihood here. So, well, in 1 year it could be this, and in many years it could be something else. So this is moving well towards the future. But of course, all of these things do have some limitations, because if it's like what calls a black swan event, that what happens 1 in 200 years, you could say, well, we could lose, £5 million if it happened, but it's only going to happen 1 in 200 years. So that's more difficult to plot the outliers. But I think this is very useful for plotting if you take a more realistic approach rather than just looking at what is the absolute worst that can happen.
Yeah. See a lot of organisations measuring and reporting on metrics. Do you have a view on the sort of metrics that help to support exec reporting?
I think when you open a box of metrics, it should have a big sign on the front of the box saying "handle with care." Metrics can be very useful, but they can also be very harmful, or just not tell the whole story. So, for example, organisations often like to say numbers rather than just costs and timelines, but the numbers in many ways are purely numbers. So, for example, if there are two organisations and one organisation hasn't patched 5 of their servers and another organisation hasn't patched 3 of their servers, it would appear that the company that's not patched 5 of their servers is in a worse state than the company that's not patched 3 of their servers. But often this may not be the case. So, for example, the company has patched 5 servers, it's 5 out of 20,000 servers, which is negligible. And in the other company, it's 3 out of 10 servers, which is significant. The other thing, of course, is it's got no bearing on how critical are these servers. So we've got plenty of servers that are unpatched, but we deliberately patch the critical ones first. So they need to be put in some sort of context. So I'd rather see people use ratios or percentages more, and it means more to the board to look in that way. The other thing is people would also like to see more reports on things like timelines. So we've had these incidents, but when did we detect it? How long did it take to detect? How long did it take to respond to? How long did it take to fix? And also costs. So we need to look at those costs. This is a typical example of some of the types of ways in which metrics can be increased in terms of their usefulness. So this is another sort of angle to look at metrics.
Yeah, I think this point is, as you get further down, it's becoming more business focused, and at the bottom there, we're talking about number of days to patch vulnerabilities on a business critical system, because perhaps we've had problems in the past with a production line problems in China, for example. We know there's a critical business impact as a result of that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the more granular you can get with risk, the better it is. So, for example, to get the most granular, you need to look at what's the risk to a particular asset. The asset could be a server, an application, a building. a person, but often we can group those together, and that becomes very time consuming to do that. But the more granular you can get, say, what's a particular risk to this particular area? It's like people talk about what's the risk of your house being burgled. Well, the risk of my house being burgled may be different to the risk of your house being burgled or somebody else's burgled. It depends on where we live, what sort of protection we've got, whether we've got burglar alarms, decent locks, that sort of thing, and what the targets are, what people are trying to go after. So you do need to put it into perspective, and the more granular you can get, the more specific, it does help people.
Great. This is just an example of some metrics. It's actually from a report from Accenture, which has been published quite recently. But this is actually giving some sort of targets, if you like, potentially that could be set for metrics, because there's some research here that showed, what the leaders were achieving compared to the non-leaders in terms of how fast they were responding to breaches, that sort of thing.
I think this comparative analysis is particularly useful, particularly when you're doing it to other organisations in a similar sector, because top managers are also always interested in what their competitors are up to, or in a particular region. So you may be less interested in what people are doing in Russia or China and more interested in what they're doing in Peru or Canada. And the other side of it, of course, is you're moving towards targets in terms of you can set your targets against people in the same, either in the same sector or who are the leading organisations.
Great, thank you, Jason. What's the way forward, do you think, for executive reporting?
My view is often the case of, well, as well as compliance, one of the main things is to help reduce the frequency and magnitude of security incidents, and particularly the magnitude relates to what they're affecting and how they affect it. I think you can build on the best practice from leading organisations and from your peers, which we've just seen. I think you can also try and make your overall security assurance and risk programme more integrated, so you've got continuous reporting, and people now have dashboards where information can come from a variety of places. It can come from vulnerability assessments, from the results of pen testing, from internal or external security audits. It can feed through from incidents that have happened in particular areas or changes in compliance, or big deal things that our customers or environment are looking at. So I think we can look forward to seeing more about this, making it more a continuous reporting element rather than quarterly or annually. I think this interactive dashboards is something that will help enormously, whether the board are ready for seeing that, or whether it's part of your own armory that you can use to selectively report to the board is a particularly useful one. But moving towards the other thing is that if you try and speak their language and look at what the big deal things are. So they want to know cost, complexity, how long does it take to do things, do I need experts in, and does it make a difference? So if you can focus on not just what we call key performance indicators, so that's the next step, is how well a key performance indicator is more how well you're performing against particular targets, is to move forward and look at key risk indicators, which look at predicting the future and trying to look at how we can protect our organisation tomorrow and not just today. And of course, that's what cyber risk is all about. It's all okay learning from what we've done in the past, or that's what we should be doing, but cyber risk is like, what's the risk of something happening in the future, which may not be the same as something happening in the past.
Great, thank you, Jason. And just the final question then, do you have any important hints and tips, sort of immediate takeaways for people?
I think there's 4 or 5 here that I could suggest. One is put things in context. So numbers and things are great, but if people don't know why it's making a difference, it can be tough. And if you can support them by some meaningful metrics, not too many, that would help. I think sometimes it's still useful to use the FUD factor. People are very scared of the FUD factor. FUD standing for fear, uncertainty, and doubt. But still, they can be effective if you use horror stories, particularly from similar organisations where they were hit by this particular NotPetya bug or similar, and we won't be because we've done this. That does tend to help. The reporting is, you can report in terms of actual and potential impact. That helps, because impact is the one common currency across the whole organisation. So things like likelihood and other risk elements vary depending on whether it's a financial risk or it's a health and safety risk or an operational risk, or something of that nature, whereas information security will calculate it in a different way. But the impact always comes down to what's the impact on the organisation. The other two things would be is to take baby steps. So if you're a mature organisation, you can move from maturity level 4 to 5, that could be your aim. But if you're maturity level 1, then don't try and leap to 4. So do take some baby steps and get something under your belt, some low-hanging fruit to make a difference. And then my final tip for today would probably be to report on what they want to hear rather than what it is that you want to tell them.
Jason, thank you very much indeed. That's been great.
Absolute pleasure, Simon.
We saw earlier that good cyber risk management is dependent upon providing accurate information to decision makers at the right time. And McKinsey proposed a cyber risk management information system and an MIS for helping to do this with the following key objectives. So making the cyber risk status of the organization's most valuable assets fully transparent, with data on the most dangerous threats and most important defenses assembled in a way that's accessible and, most importantly, comprehensible for non-specialists. It's providing decision makers with a risk-based overview of the organization so they can focus their cybersecurity investments on protecting the most valuable assets from the most dangerous threats, and it's ensuring the efficiency of measures taken to address risk by requiring a high return on cyber investment. And some practical requirements we think to deliver this is that information should be consolidated in one place. It's often in multiple different sources across the organization, but if you can bring together information on your critical assets, their interdependencies and how they relate, threats, vulnerabilities and key controls, information on what's happening in practice, so incidents, near misses, audit findings, test results, and the status of actions and improvement plans and programs, then at least you'll have an information base on which to provide this reporting. Secondly, it needs analytics and reporting to quantify, aggregate, compare against tolerance, and to support risk-informed decision making. To be integrated with existing business intelligence systems that executives are used to using. So make it easy for them, build it as part of their existing BI reporting program. Try to make it future-proof, adaptable to new technologies, able to integrate more granular data sources, and also more sophisticated algorithms for assessing cyber risks as they become available. And then finally, tailored to the organization's specific needs. And McKinsey found even a basic setup can create substantial impact because a cyber risk MIS acts as a catalyst for better, more informed decision making. And even the process of setting it up almost forces a conversation around to the level of cyber risk that the organization is prepared to tolerate. So that really sort of leads me on to conclusions. First of all, a risk-based approach is essential to achieving those good security outcomes that we looked at previously. Risk quantification is a vital tool for the risk-based approach, and I think over time this is something that we need to move towards and that a number of organizations are already embracing. We aim for an agile, scalable, continuous, Jason talked about sort of continual reporting and dashboarding, then it's becoming so important these days with a cyber risk management information system. I think if we do all of that, then we'll have the information to allow us to reduce enterprise risk, optimize cybersecurity investments, and provide operational resilience. And ultimately, I think these are really the good security outcomes. There's a resource that's available for download that goes with this webinar. It's called Giving the Board What They Want. You're very welcome to download that. This is part of a series of 3 webinars, so there were other resources from the first 2 webinars, a risk-based approach to cybersecurity and cyber risk quantifying what matters. If you didn't attend those webinars, you'd like these documents, please get in contact with us and be very happy to send them to you. Also, if you need further information, please do look at our website. You're welcome to request a personal demonstration There are other white papers, previous webinars, and of course, feel free to engage with us on social media as well. And just finally then, the fourth webinar in this series, as I mentioned earlier, will be an hour-long demonstration of Stream, looking at how our Stream supports the risk-based approach to cybersecurity, quantifying your cyber risk, and reporting to the board. There have been a couple of questions come through. So first question here is, have you seen examples of cyber risk being measured, or the impact of cyber risk being measured in relation to the impact on KPIs?
Yes, I think the answer is we have done. People are moving towards that. They call them KPIs, or also the organisation use a thing called CSFs, called critical success factors. And some organisations have a number of key performance indicators across the board, and it's not just in the information security or risk department, it's right the way across the board. And that's where, again, the impact levels can come into play. So if you say, well, what's the impact across the board in the whole organisation? What are the big ticket items? How does it relate back to our critical assets? So yes, we have seen it.
Great, thank you. Second question here, should GDPR be part of risk reporting?
Okay, I think absolutely it should be. It depends on your type of organisation. In some organisations, privacy is not the purvey of the information security or cyber risk departments. In others, it is. More and more, it may be the responsibility, for example, of the legal department or IT. And more organisations are moving towards a split of things a little bit differently. So they may have a CISO having two main departments, being a cyber security team and an information assurance team. And they would link together, but the information assurance then allows people to cover security and privacy. So that's one example. But the privacy elements, they're certainly mentioned in ISO 27001. There's information privacy stuff in there. They mention things like the ISO standard of practice in some depth, and they mention elsewhere. And of course, within GDPR itself, a number of the articles in there do relate specifically to information security, secure by design, secure by default, and they also even cover off things like confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So there are both specific things about information security in GDPR, even if you're not part of the department responsible for it. But if you are part of responsible for it, then you've got a much wider remit, and you're able to report as part of your integrated cyber risk suite.
Brilliant. Okay, great, thank you. Another one here, actually. At the board level, cyber risk tends to be a single line amongst the multiplicity of risks being presented in a heat map format by enterprise risks. How do you suggest we break out of that paradigm to make the business impact a potential cyber incident?
Yeah, I wish I knew. I think this is an evolution rather than a revolution. As time goes on, people at the board level are becoming more au fait or more cognizant of what's going on, and information risk and information security is becoming much more of a big deal ticket and what I call a general day-to-day impact on the guy in the pub. And you can see that with advertisements on television for protecting personal information and this kind of thing. But I think the number of the major incidents we're getting is going to push them in that direction. I think we haven't really seen the big deal incidents yet. I think there's still to come. So I think the answer is yes, it's an evolutionary thing. But of course, from a board perspective, saying, well, if the impact isn't as big as some other parts of the organisation, why do you want to know? So I think part of it is we'll keep plugging away at it, but it's life, and we'll have to live with it if it's like it is.
Okay, and just one more for you, Jason. Is there an ideal number of metrics that you should aim to have? How often should they be reviewed to identify if they can be improved or no longer provide value to the execs?
Well, obviously the answer is 42, as we all know. But the answer is I don't think there is an optimal number of metrics at all. I think it completely depends on your organisation, how many controls and risks you've got in place, what the size is, And I think I would rather, at the top level, keep it to a very small number of metrics and link them to key performance indicators and particularly key risk indicators. So the metrics then should be there. And if you've got it using an interactive dashboard or similar, people can see at the high level there are these 5 things. They could cover cost, they could cover impact, they could cover compliance, they could cover risk, and then you drill down on them, and then the metrics. So at the bottom level, you can have thousands of metrics, and if you've got a lot of the integrated reportings, it will generate thousands of metrics, and then of course you get the problem there, which one's the most important. So I don't think there is one answer, but I think it's a pyramid. So at the top, keep it as small as possible, but be able to drill down and drill down and drill down.
Jason, thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate your contribution to this. As we said earlier, feel free to contact us. Details are on the screen here. And if you'd like to join the next webinar in a fortnight's time, we'd love to see you there. Thanks very much, everybody.